It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the knock came at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I didn't think much of it at first. The house was tucked away on a quiet street at the edge of the city, and the only visitors I typically had were the neighbors or the occasional delivery driver. I stood up from the couch, wiping my hands on my jeans, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, I saw two uniformed officers standing in the driveway, their faces obscured by dark sunglasses. A third officer stood in the background, his posture tense. Before I could even ask what they wanted, the door was thrown open, and they rushed inside without a word. "Police! Don't move!" one of them shouted. I froze, trying to process what was happening. "What's going on?" I demanded, instinctively taking a step back toward the kitchen. "Stay where you are." Another officer barked. "We have a warrant to search this property." I glanced at the officer holding what appeared to be a piece of paper in his hand, but something didn't feel right. The officer didn't even show it to me, nor did he give any explanation for why they were here. Something about their urgency and the way they moved through the house was off. I clenched my fists, and for a split second, I thought about fighting back. But I knew I couldn't. "Who's in charge here?" I asked, my voice steady, even though the adrenaline was starting to creep in. The officer who had spoken first stepped forward, his face an unreadable mask. "We don't have time for questions. Move aside." I stepped back, my heart pounding. Something was wrong. This wasn't a typical raid. As the officers spread out, their heavy boots echoing through the hallway, I stood there, frozen. I could feel my pulse racing, my mind running through countless possibilities. Who had sent them? What were they really looking for? The first officer, the one who had barged through the door, scanned the living room like he was looking for something specific. "Search everything," he muttered to the others, his voice sharp. I watched them move through the house, each room they entered becoming more chaotic. The second officer knocked over a chair as he rummaged through a bookshelf. The third officer moved into the kitchen, pulling open drawers, throwing utensils and papers onto the floor with reckless abandon. It was as if they were trying to intimidate me, trying to make me feel helpless. I could hear them shouting orders to each other, but it didn't feel like they were looking for anything. It felt like they were trying to provoke me into reacting. "Stop!" I finally snapped, my voice cutting through the noise. "You're trespassing. You can't just come in here like this without showing me a warrant." The first officer turned to face me, his face twisted in anger. "We don't need a warrant for a high-priority investigation," he sneered. "Now shut up and stay where you are." But his words didn't seem to carry the same weight anymore. I could feel it in the air, the tension was shifting. I could sense that they were starting to doubt themselves. And in that moment, I knew something they didn't. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The sound of a door slamming open echoed down the hallway. They turned, startled, as I stepped into the living room. I didn't hesitate. The officers were still focused on searching, not paying attention to me. I was calm, every movement deliberate. "Your time's up," I said, my voice low but carrying authority. They all stopped in their tracks, confused. Then, the realization hit them. I wasn't just any homeowner. I was Delta Force. The room fell into an eerie silence. The officers stood frozen, their eyes darting between me and each other. They had barged into my home, weaponized and sure of themselves, but now, their confidence was visibly slipping. I didn't need to say another word. My stance alone, the way I held myself, gave it away. I watched as the realization sank in, like a weight dropping into a deep, silent well. Their faces paled, and I could see the hesitation creeping into their movements. The second officer, who had been tearing through my kitchen, lowered his hand from a drawer and stepped back, his eyes now wide. "Why you're Delta Force?" one of them stammered. It was the first time I'd seen one of them unsure, and it wasn't a pleasant sight. "That's right," I said evenly. "And you've just made a huge mistake. The officers exchanged glances, their previous bravado crumbling into confusion and fear. I knew what was coming next. They would try to save face, make excuses, and pretend they hadn't just violated every protocol in the book. But I could already see the doubt in their eyes. They knew they had messed up, big time. The first officer took a hesitant step forward. We were just following orders," he muttered, his voice now shaky. "Orders?" I raised an eyebrow. "From who?" They didn't answer immediately. Their hesitation spoke volumes. I was certain they hadn't been told who I was, and if they had, they wouldn't have acted so recklessly. I took another step toward them, the space between us closing. The officer who had been closest to the door shifted nervously, his hand inching toward the sidearm strapped to his hip. But the movement was too slow. Too unsure. "I didn't ask for your excuses," I said, my voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "I want to know who sent you." They fumbled, but no one seemed to have an answer. It became clear that their actions weren't authorized, not by any credible chain of command. I could feel the weight of the moment, the power I held, but I didn't enjoy it. This wasn't a game. This was about making sure the right people were held accountable. They had walked into the wrong house. And now, they would have to face the consequences. The officers stood frozen, their nervous glances darting between one another. It wasn't just the situation that had them on edge, it was the realization that they had made an unforgivable mistake. They had barged into the home of someone they now knew was far beyond their ability to intimidate. The first officer, still trying to regain his composure, spoke in a voice that shook just slightly. "We were told there was a potential threat, we didn't know who you were," he said, his words now trailing off, lacking conviction. "Potential threat?" I repeated, my tone hard as stone. "And you just decided to break in? No warrant, no proper intel?" His eyes flickered, and I could tell he wanted to argue, but there was nothing he could say to justify his actions now. Not when the truth was so glaringly obvious. I could see the way the others were shifting uncomfortably, waiting for him to take control, but it was clear they were no longer in charge of this situation. I stepped closer, letting the silence hang heavy between us. "You're going to call your superior, now," I said, my words firm. "And when you do, you'll make sure you mention who you've been dealing with." The second officer, who had been the most vocal earlier, swallowed hard. His bravado was gone, replaced by a mix of fear and uncertainty. He took a shaky step backward, clearly wanting to avoid further confrontation. I need to call this in," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Do it," I said coldly. "But understand this, if you think this ends with a phone call, you're wrong. You've crossed a line. And I'm not just going to forget it." He hesitated, then pulled out his radio, his fingers trembling as he tried to get the words out. The static crackled, and I could hear him fumbling through his message to dispatch. I crossed my arms, watching them, making it clear I wasn't going anywhere until they fixed this. The third officer, who had stayed mostly silent until now, shifted nervously from foot to foot, clearly realizing just how deep they had dug themselves into trouble. His face flushed as he caught my gaze, and I could tell he was praying for some kind of miracle. They were on borrowed time. And I wasn't going to let them off easy. Not after this. Not after the fear they had tried to instill in my home. The seconds felt like hours as the officer fumbled with his radio, the words he spoke only half comprehensible through the static. His hands were shaking so badly that the mic nearly slipped from his grip. I could tell he was realizing the full extent of the mistake they'd made. And that realization was coming too late. "Officer 1229, requesting immediate backup, situation escalated, need a supervisor," he stammered, each word carrying the weight of their misjudgment. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick with the regret they hadn't voiced until now. I stood still, my arms crossed, watching as they tried to piece together the broken narrative they had created. They hadn't just violated my home, they had unwittingly walked into the lion's den, and they were now reeling from the consequences of their actions. The clock was ticking, and there was no easy way out for them. After a long pause, the radio crackled again, a voice on the other end snapping commands. I couldn't make out the exact words, but I could tell it wasn't good news for the officers. Their supervisor would be arriving soon, and I could only imagine what kind of fallout they would face. I told you this was a mistake, I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of authority. You can't just do whatever you want and expect it to disappear. You've made the wrong call. The first officer who had spoken to me earlier took a slow step toward me, his hands up in a gesture of surrender. His voice was barely above a whisper. We didn't know who you were. If you had, you wouldn't be standing here right now, I interrupted, my tone cutting him off. There was no room for half-hearted apologies. Not after what they'd done. The door swung open, and footsteps echoed from the porch. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, followed by 2 more officers. He moved with a calm assurance that immediately caught my attention. His eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on me with an expression of recognition. Is this the situation? He asked, his voice calm but authoritative. The way he spoke, I knew he wasn't just any supervisor. He knew what he was walking into. I nodded slowly. These officers came in without a warrant. No warning. They didn't know who I was, but now they do. The new arrival, clearly the officer in charge, turned his gaze to the first officer, his eyes narrowing. Do you have any idea who you just stormed the house of? The first officer's face flushed crimson. Sir, I asked you a question, the supervisor snapped, cutting him off. Who did you just walk in on? The officer stammered, barely able to get the words out. I didn't, his voice faltered. The supervisor turned back to me, his demeanor shifting instantly, no longer questioning but now understanding the full scope of the mistake. I think we need to have a serious conversation. I met his gaze evenly, unflinching. I agree. The supervisor, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, took a deep breath and stepped further into the house, his eyes never leaving mine. He glanced at the officers who had clearly crossed the line and then back at me. The air in the room had shifted again. The chaos was quieting, but the weight of their blunder was hanging over them like a storm cloud. Gentlemen, the supervisor said, his voice calm but laced with disappointment, you've done more than just violate protocol. You've put all of us in a very dangerous position. He turned his attention back to me. I'm sorry for the intrusion. We'll fix this. I didn't respond immediately. There was no point. What could they possibly say to make this right? The damage was done. But that didn't mean it had to go unaddressed. I don't think an apology is enough here, I said, my voice steady but carrying the gravity of my words. What happens now? Do I just go back to living like nothing happened? The supervisor took another step closer, his gaze unwavering. He looked like a man who was accustomed to tough situations, but even he knew there was no easy way out of this one. No, of course not, he said, his voice softer now. You deserve better than that. And I'll make sure this gets dealt with. I nodded slowly. Good. Because I don't just want this to go away. You're going to make sure it's known that this wasn't just a mistake. It was an abuse of power. The supervisor's eyes flickered, and for a moment, I saw something in his expression, a recognition, a flicker of understanding that I wasn't just another civilian. I could tell he was realizing this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Not with me involved. We'll get to the bottom of this, he said, his voice firm again. And these officers will answer for what they did. You have my word. I watched him carefully, the tension still hanging thick in the room. But something had shifted. The uncertainty in their eyes had been replaced with a mix of guilt and fear. They knew the consequences of their actions wouldn't just stay in the confines of this house. I want everything documented, I said, turning to the officer in charge. All the names. All the details. And I want a full investigation into this. The supervisor nodded. Of course. We'll make sure it's handled properly. You'll get everything you need. As the officers began to process what had happened, I felt the weight of the situation settle in. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about power, authority, and how those in positions of control could sometimes forget the basic rules they were sworn to uphold. I had nothing left to say. The damage was done, and it would be their job to fix it. But I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They had underestimated me, and now they would learn just how far that mistake could take them. The supervisor turned back toward the door, signaling for the officers to follow him. They shuffled out, leaving me standing alone in my own home once again. The door clicked shut behind them, and the silence returned, but this time, it felt different. It felt like a victory. A victory for justice. And for those who knew how to wield power when it was needed most. As the last of the officers filed out, I remained standing in the living room, my eyes fixed on the now closed door. The tension was finally starting to dissipate, but a sense of urgency still hung in the air. I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I moved to the kitchen, my mind racing. I could feel the adrenaline still coursing through me, the aftershock of the confrontation still pulsing in my veins. But there was no time to linger in the aftermath. What had just happened couldn't go unaddressed, and it certainly couldn't be left to chance. The phone in my pocket vibrated, pulling me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out and saw a name that immediately made my heart skip a beat, Command. I didn't hesitate. I answered it, my voice calm but purposeful. This is Carter. Carter, what the hell happened? The voice on the other end was familiar, my commanding officer, a no-nonsense kind of person who didn't tolerate mistakes. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. We've just been briefed about what went down. This better not be as bad as it sounds. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath before speaking. It's exactly as bad as it sounds, I said quietly. A group of officers stormed my home without a warrant, claiming they were responding to a threat. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. There was a long pause on the other end. Are you all right? She finally asked, her tone shifting to concern. I'm fine, I answered. They weren't prepared for what they found. But I need this handled. I don't just want a report or an apology. I want this to be made known. They can't get away with this. Another pause, then a deep sigh. I'll take care of it. You've done the right thing by staying calm. But we'll make sure those officers answer for their actions. You're right, they can't just walk away from this. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Good. And if it's not handled properly, I'll be the one making sure it gets exposed. The public needs to know what happened. Understood. You'll have all the support you need. But don't take this lightly, Carter. This could get ugly. I'm counting on you to make sure it doesn't, I said, my voice steady, despite the storm brewing on the horizon. After the call ended, I stood in silence for a moment, allowing the weight of the situation to fully sink in. The officers may have walked out of my house, but this wasn't over. It wasn't over for them, and it certainly wasn't over for me. I knew exactly what had to happen next. This was only the beginning. The weight of what had transpired in my home still lingered in the air. The officers were gone, but I knew they weren't the only ones who would be facing the fallout. The entire chain of command had just been shaken, and I could feel the ripple effect already starting to build. I walked over to my living room window and looked out over the quiet street. It felt surreal, as if the world had somehow shifted under my feet. A part of me wanted to feel relieved, to put the whole incident behind me. But deep down, I knew better. The real work was just beginning. My phone buzzed again, interrupting my thoughts. Another name flashed across the screen, an unexpected contact this time. It was a reporter from a major news outlet. I didn't recognize the number, but I had a pretty good guess about what this call was about. I answered, my tone neutral. "This is Carter." "Mr. Carter?" The voice on the other end was smooth, professional. "This is Emily Trent from National News. I'm calling regarding an incident that took place earlier today at your residence. Can you confirm you were involved in an altercation with local law enforcement?" I didn't flinch. "I wouldn't call it an altercation," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But yes, officers entered my home without a warrant. They did not identify themselves properly and did not follow proper procedures." Her tone shifted, clearly intrigued. "Are you suggesting this was more than a simple misunderstanding? There's talk of a possible cover-up. And you're saying this wasn't an isolated incident?" I paused, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. "What I'm saying is this: they made a mistake. A big one. They came in without cause, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. I'm not going to let this go unnoticed." I could almost hear her scribbling notes on the other end. "You realize this could get very public, very fast. Are you prepared for the consequences of going public with this?" I took a deep breath. "I'm more than prepared. But they need to understand that actions like this have consequences. They can't hide behind their badges and expect to get away with it." The reporter was silent for a moment, likely processing everything I'd said. Finally, she spoke again. "We'll be following up with you, Mr. Carter. You've just opened a very big door." "I'm aware," I replied, my voice firm. "But it's a door that needs to be opened." The call ended, and I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone. The tension was palpable, the weight of the decision I'd just made beginning to settle in. Going public was risky, but it was also necessary. These officers thought they could walk all over me, but they had underestimated who they were dealing with. And now the world would see just how badly they had messed up. As I set the phone down, I knew I couldn't just wait around for everything to unfold. I had to be proactive. The investigation needed to be thorough, and I needed to make sure it was seen to the end. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, making my way to the car. There were still a few pieces to put into place, but I wasn't about to sit back and wait for them to resolve things. I had a responsibility now, not just to myself, but to anyone who might find themselves in the same situation. The next step in this journey had begun. And it was going to be a fight. But I was ready. The drive to the police station was long, but every minute felt like an eternity. My thoughts raced as I gripped the steering wheel, the hum of the tires against the asphalt the only sound in the car. The weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy over me, but I wasn't going to back down. I had come this far. There was no turning back. When I pulled into the parking lot, I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air felt colder now, and the stillness of the station only heightened the tension I was feeling. Inside, the officers were going about their business, unaware of what was about to unfold. I made my way to the front desk and was met by a receptionist who looked up at me with a practiced, neutral expression. She didn't recognize me, she didn't know who I was, and that was exactly what I needed. I wasn't here for a confrontation. I was here for answers. "I need to speak with the officer in charge," I said, my voice steady. She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask any questions. Instead, she nodded and directed me down the hallway to the back offices. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls as I walked through the narrow corridor, my mind still locked on what was at stake. I knocked once on the door of the supervisor's office before pushing it open. The supervisor I had spoken to earlier was sitting behind his desk, looking over some paperwork. He glanced up when I entered, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he didn't seem surprised to see me. "You wanted to talk?" he asked, his voice calm but cautious. "I do," I replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. "I think it's time for us to have a more detailed conversation." He didn't say anything at first, but his posture stiffened, and I could tell he knew exactly where this was going. "I already told you this would be dealt with. And I appreciate that," I said, my voice firm. But this isn't just about what happened today. This is about accountability. About making sure nothing like this happens again. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, studying me. You're going to make sure everyone knows about this, aren't you? I nodded. That's the plan. He let out a slow breath, the reality of the situation sinking in. You're sure about this? I'm sure, I said without hesitation. This isn't just about me. This is about anyone else who might find themselves in the same position. We can't keep letting this kind of abuse slide. It's time for a change. He looked down at his hands for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he nodded. I'll do everything I can to make sure the right people are held accountable. You've made your point. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the finality of the words settle in. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out. The hard part was done. As I stepped back into the cold evening air, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The battle wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. The truth was out there now, and there was no going back. The system would have to change, whether they liked it or not. I got into my car, the engine humming to life beneath me. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lights of the station faded behind me, and I couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning of something much larger. This wasn't just about a single home invasion. This was about making sure that the abuse of power never happened again. And I'd be the one making sure it didn't. The road ahead might be long, but I was ready for whatever came next.